Thanks, Jenny, for that very generous introduction. I won't tell you what happens at the end of the book. It's a surprise ending. We actually win.
Don't be a spoiler.
So I thought I'd talk after about 25 minutes. I thought I would talk to you, all of you good people getting up so early on a Saturday morning, to make arguments in favour of democracy. Now, this might seem like a pretty fatuous thing to do because everyone says they're in favour of democracy. And in a way, if I came here and told you I was going to make an argument against democracy, you'd have a bit more of an idea where I was coming from. Probably not a very good place, but you have some idea of my politics. But simply to say you're for democracy doesn't really explain that much because it's a term that means so many different things to so many different people. And the Welsh socialist thinker Raymond Williams actually has a really interesting argument about this. He says if you ever come across a term that means lots of different things to different people, it's worth trying to pick it apart because it usually masks some kind of social antagonism that's worth exploring. And democracy is actually one of the words that he looks at in his little book, Right Words. I don't know if any of you have ever read it, but it's a fantastic kind of volume, a sort of political lexicon. And he says, well, democracy comes into the English language from ancient Greek in the 16th century, and it's more or less a direct steal from Greek to mean rule by the people. But the interesting thing about it is, in its first usage, it was used overwhelmingly as a pejorative term. So that for a respectable society, democracy was something bad. What it meant was something equivalent to mob rule. It meant that ordinary people were going to take charge of society and they were going to oppress their betters. And, you know, if you look in Roget's Thesaurus, you can still see an echo of that. One of the synonyms for democrat is commoner. As late as 1848, during the revolutions across Europe at that time, people were still referring to the insurgents as the democracy. That was what democracy meant. It meant ordinary people taking control and running society themselves and doing so in a way that terrified respectable society. So it was only later that the idea of democracy became something that respectable people were in favour of. And you can actually see this process working through in the debates that happened around the American Revolution. And when the founding fathers are trying to decide what kind of society this democratic revolution has built. So Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was committed to a form of democracy that was very much this older sense of the word. Democracy meant direct rule by the people. He had this vision of an America that was going to be based around villages where people would not only be voting but would actually be implementing the decisions themselves. This kind of society of direct democracy. But of course, he wasn't the only one of the founding fathers, and amongst the various people putting the Constitution together, there are all sorts of different opinions. Jefferson described himself as a friend of the people. Others describe themselves differently. So Alexander Hamilton, he of Broadway musical fame, saw the people quite differently. He saw them as a sort of animalistic force. He described them on stage as the beast. And the point of democracy for him was to tame the people and to make them manageable. And the way that this would happen is you would have a system where representatives were elected, and then there would be an array of checks and balances that would allow those representatives to run society unimpeded by the beast. And of course, this is very much the model that we are familiar with today. It's the sort of theory that underlies parliamentary democracy around the developed world. So Williams says that if you talk to conservatives or to liberals, when they talk about democracy, this is what they mean. Representative democracy, kind of Hamiltonian idea. But he also says that you can see traces of the older idea of democracy as a term that means popular rule when you look at the labour movement and the left and mobilisations and demonstrations. So he's writing this in the mid-1970s, and he says that, you know, when you see these kind of events, you see this older sense of democracy manifesting itself. And really interestingly, he says that these two versions of democracy now confront each other as enemies. And what does he mean by that? Well, if you think about a hypothetical example where, say, a Conservative government comes to power with a program of something like privatisation and sets about trying to implement it, and then one of the public service unions calls a mass strike. For people on the left, that strike would be a manifestation of democracy. You go to the meetings, everyone votes on what they're going to do, they get all of their friends involved. In fact, it's a level of political engagement most of us don't have. It seems the very quintessence of democracy. At the same time, however, the Conservatives would say this strike action is undemocratic because there's been an election, the people have voted, government has implemented its policy, and people who are trying to stand in the way of that are opponents of democracy. So you can see how these two conceptions stand opposed to each other, even though the terminology is exactly the same. And what's kind of interesting is how the world has moved on since the 70s when Williams was writing that book. Partly the left and the Labor movement have declined, so that very few of us have those experiences of direct demonstrations and protests where we get a sense of kind of popular rule. But also the neoliberal turn has meant that the notion of representation has also kind of changed. Because if you think about the whole neoliberal project, the idea is to try and turn as much of human society into something that's managed by markets rather than people. So it's fundamentally hostile to any notion of participatory democracy and is very much about putting experts and technocrats in charge of society. So it's a model of representative democracy that very much emphasises the checks and balances that keep ordinary people from interfering with the market. And alongside this, I think this evolution is really significant because it coincides with an evolution in the way the left thinks about what its project is. One of the arguments I try to make in that Trigger Warnings book is to say that the common sense of the left about oppression, about sexism, about racism, about other ideas stems from the great social movements, by and large, from the great social movements of the 60s and the 1970s. But those movements changed over time. So the early incarnations of all of those movements were dominated by what I call in the book direct politics. And that is an idea that was shared by more or less all of the different tendencies on the left, even if they interpret it differently. An idea that oppression of various kinds was a structural problem, that it was something that was created by the institutions of society. So the way to overcome this oppression was to change the structures of society, and the force that was going to do this was the people as a whole. So what you did if you were a left-winger was you mobilised the people to fight against racism and sexism, and this is something that they would accomplish by changing society as a whole. And so the key element of direct politics is the notion that the people are the solution to racism, sexism, other forms of oppression. However, as those mobilisations died away and as it became more and more difficult to mobilise people in the late 70s and the early 1980s, the left, the thinkers on the left, began to move away from a notion of direct politics and towards an idea that I call delegated politics, which is very much an idea of representation, where the project of the left became not so much mobilising people themselves to change society through demonstrations or protests or whatever, but changing society on behalf of those people. So increasingly those activists who had positions at universities or NGOs or in the public service or whatever saw their role as using the structures of society to change society on the behalf of the people rather than the people doing it by themselves. So an idea of delegated politics, rather than the people being the solution, the people are the beneficiaries. And then, in about the mid-2000s, we saw the development of something that I call smug politics, which is the development of that idea from a notion that the people are the solution through the idea that the people are the beneficiaries and increasingly an idea that the people are the problem. And those of you who remember the demonstrations against the Iraq War, I think this was a really key moment where we mobilised the biggest ever protests in human history. Demonstrations on every continent in the world, including Antarctica, where the scientists marched around against the war, and the war still went ahead. And in the wake of that, there was a level of demoralisation where people began to argue, the problem isn't us, the problem are the masses out there. The reason, and particularly after George W. Bush was re-elected, this notion that the problem was ordinary people are racist and sexist and stupid, and that's why they vote for these people. And the key text at the time, I was working as a bookseller at the time, and we sold 1 trillion copies of this, was Michael Moore's book, Stupid White Men, which expresses this idea really kind of neatly, that the reason we have this stupid Republican president is Americans are stupid and they get the president that they deserve. We on the left have these good ideas, but the reason we can't implement them is all of those idiots are out there won't listen to us. The other cultural artefact from that time that I think really epitomises this is that movie Idiocracy. I don't know if any of you saw this, but it's a satire that posits a future America where the clever people have stopped breeding, allowing America to be taken over by stupid people. So the America of the future is full of these morbidly obese drones who sit around watching reality TV and masturbating. And this is what America has become. And when you think about it, this is an extraordinarily elitist social critique. But at the time, it was presented as a left-wing one. The problem is we have all these good ideas about fighting racism and sexism. We can't implement them because ordinary Americans are so dumb. And of course, this notion, this kind of idea of smug politics really reached a crescendo in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election, where it became a really kind of common explanation for what had happened. Because, of course, people were rightfully appalled by the fact that this, hideous creature had become the president of the most powerful country in the world. But the way that a lot of people on the left explained this was through this kind of smug politics lens, and this is our visual aid now. People might remember this cartoon. Can you see it at the back? For those who can't, it's a drawing of a scene inside a plane where one of the passengers puts his hand up and says, does he say,
These pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane?
Exactly. So who thinks I should fly the plane? And this went viral in 2017, early January 2017, just after the Trump election. It was shared by people who were appalled by the racism and sexism of the Trump administration, and rightfully so. What's really interesting, however, this is not a cartoon attacking racism or sexism. This is a cartoon putting forward a particular model of democracy. And it's an incredibly elitist model of democracy. If you think about the metaphor is society is something as complicated as a plane, this sophisticated piece of equipment, and the idea that ordinary people might be able to direct it is both comical and frightening, because if they try to take over from the plane or society from those who are experts in flying it, well, it'll probably crash and we'll probably all be destroyed. And if you think about it, this is an extraordinarily patronising view of the population. But again, the key point is this was a cartoon that was being circulated not by the right, but by the left. And in the wake of Brexit and Trump's election, versions of this were all over the place. Jacobin, that American magazine, published a really interesting piece looking at all of the articles that appeared about populism and democracy in the wake of Trump's election, and there were huge numbers of them. Now, there's all kinds of left-wing critiques you can make of populism, particularly right-wing populism. It's very easy to say that right-wing populism is a fraudulent doctrine because it presents itself as being about participation and about the masses being involved in politics, but at the same time, it's a discourse of exclusion because it's based on racism and sexism, so it's not participatory at all. And so it's a fraudulent doctrine that ends up putting in power people like Donald Trump, who is, a sort of bloated plutocrat, sort of straight off the Monopoly board, and puts him forward as a representative of the masses. That's a really long-standing left-wing critique that you can make of right-wing populism. You can say that it's not participatory enough, That wasn't the critique that was being made by Liberals in the United States after Trump's election. Their critique of populism wasn't that it wasn't participatory enough, it was that it was too participatory. So the argument was the problem with populism is it allowed the masses to come onto the stage of politics, and they then infected everything with their racist and sexist and stupid ideas, and Trump was the result of that. So you had all of these well-meaning liberals talking about how we needed to come up with checks and balances to prevent something like Brexit or the Trump election ever happening again. And in the wake of the 2016 American election, there were all of these kind of angsty discussions about how was it possible that this guy who was a billionaire, whose whole persona was based on conspicuous consumption, how is it he could run and win as an anti-elitist? Well, I think the answer to that, one of the answers to it, is he was able to do that because so many of his opponents were self-consciously and proudly elitists who said that the task of the left is to try to prevent ordinary people infecting politics with their racism and their sexism. And when you take that position, you make it very, very easy for right-wing populists to defeat you. How are we going for time?
You're right, you've got another 10 minutes.
Another 10 minutes, okay.
You don't have to take it all, but you're very welcome to. I'm very keen.
Okay, so how is this relevant to us today? I mean, the Trump election was in another country and quite some time ago. So how are these debates relevant to us here in Australia? Well, for me, one of the most exciting things that's happened in Australian politics in a long time is the birth of this new movement around climate change, exemplified by Extinction Rebellion, or in Melbourne, where I'm from, the blockade of IMARC, the International Mining Conference, which is happening later in the year, or the student walkout. This new grassroots movement against the destruction of the planet that is underway at a frightening rate at the moment. And it's so exciting because it's a return to the kind of direct politics that I'm talking about. It's a campaign that says we need to mobilise as many people as possible. We need those people on the street. We need them to be involved in civil disobedience, protests, or whatever. These people are the solution. At the same time, however, I think it's really important for us to tease out our own ideas about democracy, because it's very, very easy for these other ideas to kind of creep in. And I'll give you an example of something I've been thinking about in the context of that movement. One of the slogans that comes up again and again in the climate movement is the idea of a climate emergency. It's the number one demand of Extinction Rebellion. It's put forward by all sorts of people in the climate movement. And usually the comparison is we need governments to declare a climate emergency on the scale of the Second World War. And the reason why the comparison is with the Second World War is because when war broke out, most of the developed countries underwent an economic transformation that was extraordinarily rapid. I think in Britain, I think the figures are in 1938, Britain was spending something like 7% of its GDP on armaments. By 1943, that figure was 55%. And in fact, half of the entire population was working in the war industries by 1943. It's an extraordinary shift in the economic priorities of society, and it gives a lie to the idea that we can't make the kinds of changes necessary to mitigate the destruction of our planet that's taking place at the moment. If we wanted to do it, we could do it remarkably quickly. There's no doubt about that. But we also need to talk about the politics of that transformation. And actually, one of the people who spells this out really clearly is the long-standing environmental philosopher James Lovelock, who has a book where he makes precisely this case. He says that, look, we face an emergency, we need a declaration of a climate emergency, we're in a situation comparable to Britain in 1940, and we need to do a similar kind of transformation. But he spells out the politics of it. He says the transformation in Britain was made possible by abolishing elections. The British government formed a unity government that was unaccountable to Parliament. Most of its meetings happened in secret. and gave itself vast and incredibly coercive powers. And that was the basis on which this transformation took place. And Lovelock says we need to do something like that. So we need to abolish democracy. We can't, the emergency is so dire and so disastrous, we can't fuck around anymore with discussion or debating. We just need someone, an authoritarian government, to take control and to take charge of things. Now, the majority of the people who talk about the declaration of the climate emergency today don't know that at all. And I'm not suggesting that they do. Actually, all they mean is that this is serious and we need to do something about it. In fact, if you were going to make a critique of a slogan, I think one of the more immediately practical critique would be to say that actually most of the time when governments declare this doesn't mean anything at all. The city of Melbourne just declared that, nothing happens as a consequence. Nevertheless, I do think we need to think through this temptation to see that because things are so dire, we need someone to take charge, because underlying it is that notion of smart politics, that people are the problem and they need to be compelled by people like us to do the right thing. And if you think about the environment, it's very easy to end up in that sort of position. You think like the masses don't recycle their stuff, they're not interested in the environment, they drive huge cars around everywhere, they're incredibly wasteful in their lifestyles. These people are not our allies, these people are a problem that need to be compelled to do the right thing. And it can very easily push us into that direction of smart politics. Now, we're not in a position where we can declare a state of emergency and make ourselves dictators of society and tell everyone what to do. So it's not like that's an immediate problem. Nevertheless, I think this attitude can manifest itself in the kind of movements that we build, where we think we don't have time for democratic processes anymore. It's too urgent. And in any case, if we give these people a say, they'll only fuck things up with their stupid ideas. So therefore, we have to decide on their behalf and bulldoze things through. And there are two reasons why I think this is a problem, and I'll finish up on this because I know we want to have a discussion. The first reason is an immediately practical one. And you can see the significance of this from the American example. If we take this position, if we adopt the logic of smart politics, it makes it very, very easy for the right to mobilise against us. It makes it very, very easy for the movement to be presented as elitist, because indeed it would be elitist. And that was exactly what the American left discovered. If you have this sort of perspective that ordinary people are the problem, then you end up in a situation where, someone like Donald Trump, who is a New York real estate developer, can present himself as more of a representative of the people than you are. And when that happens, you're doing something pretty fundamentally wrong. So that's the first thing. Strategically and tactically, this kind of orientation is disastrous and always loses. If you present the people as the problem, not surprisingly, the people are not going to come on your side. So I'm not suggesting that we become starry-eyed about the masses. I'm not suggesting, it would be ludicrous and ridiculous to pretend that ordinary people always are always anti-sexist or anti-racist, or always have good positions on the environment. Of course that's not true. Of course there is sexism and racism and anti-environmental ideas in the masses of the population. The question is how you deal with that. If you see the problems as being structural problems, if you see the force that's capable of making social change as the people being the people as a whole, then you approach these people as potential allies and you seek to win them over. If you see the people as innately a problem and fundamentally backward, rather than winning them over, you try to write them off and you try to create structures that silo them out of politics so they can't infect it with their wrong ideas. And you see the difference. If we go out there and try to argue with people, we have a chance of convincing them. There's no guarantee that we will convince them, but we have a chance. If we write them off, we're never going to convince them. And the second reason, and I'll finish on this, why this is significant, is much more of a theoretical one. And it goes to the heart of the environmental catastrophe that we face. Because when we talk about climate change, we're really using climate change as a metonym for an environmental catastrophe as a whole. Climate change is only part of the total destruction of nature that's taking place at the moment. So it was the most recent depressing statistic I saw. Orangutans are scheduled for extinction within the next 10 years. This is not being caused by climate change, it's being caused by deforestation, which is a different, albeit related, problem. The problem is our relationship with nature as a whole. How is this relationship determined? The problem is at the moment is the way we engage with nature is innately authoritarian. That is, the way that production in society is governed is that we produce for exchange rather than use, in the classical Marxist terms. That means that rather than deciding what things we need, the things that get produced are the things that can be sold, the things that can make a profit for someone, irrespective of how environmentally destructive they are. So if you can make a profit destroying the forests of Borneo, well and good, that's what happens. Well, what then is a solution to that? The solution to that is just to move to a society that produces for use. Because production is the predominant way that we interact with nature. If we're going to reinvent our relationship with nature, we have to move to a society in which production is carried out for use. What does that mean? How do we decide what we want to use? That's an innately democratic question. So deciding that we want a society of production for use means we have to have systems by which we can decide what things we actually want to do. And that means setting up new structures of participatory democracy. Structures that gather not just what happens in something like Parliament, but the more fundamental and basic aspects of our lives, the kind of priorities we as a society have. Now that can sound utopian, but I think we're in a situation now where if you're not putting forward utopian suggestions, you're not being realistic. Because the problems that we face are so severe that anyone who tells you they can fix the environmental catastrophe with just a few minor changes is lying to you. And so I think if we are to investigate our relationship with nature, we need to fundamentally re-examine the way we think about democracy and move to a new acceptance of participatory democracy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Do you want to take the
So one of the projects I've been seeing with the relationship to the broad mass of people has been to depersonalise, or is to create the image of professional politics as being dirty and something that you shouldn't be engaged in as a way of analysing them. It seems that this is actually playing into on both sides of the right and the left. The right are happy to push them out there and then say you're a champion, where the left are saying, oh look, they're all out there being awful, we shouldn't engage with them, or they're the problem. Is there a solution on that side of the equation where we try and re-engage that politics is actually something that ordinary people need to be involved in rather than just being so dirty that we should just look at question time, it's so awful?
Thank you very much. I found that very interesting. And unfortunately, every time you say something, I think of a point, and then you go on and say something else. But going back to your earlier description of Hamiltonian democracy, I think you called it delegated democracy. I think we still suffer from that in the United States, in that Clinton did receive 3 million more votes than Trump. But then it was the electoral college system that saw Trump's election. So that means that you cannot wipe off the populace as being uninformed and ignorant. In this state, and I've talked more about New South Wales than other states, we have that form of delegated democracy in the upper houses, the legislative councils of the state. The significant thing I think we've seen here that we haven't seen in the United States is the voting systems for those upper houses have changed so that we get proportional representation rather than single-member electorates. That has meant that our upper house, particularly I can't speak for other states, has become much more diversified and representative of currents throughout the community. And we have the ironic situation where in Queensland, in the incredibly radical early 1920s, in the midst of police strikes, the Labor government there abolished the upper house in Queensland, and consequently we get a much more conservative lower house there than we have in other states. But the thing that really gets to me is that I read the Sydney Morning Herald and whatever, and so I'm often comforted by the letters that I read in there, but I don't read the Daily Telegraph on a regular basis. But when I do, I'm shocked by the expressions used that appear. And I wonder, is the key issue not the ignorance of the population, but the access to media and the dumbing down of the debate, the loss of complexity, and the silencing of alternative viewpoints? And I wonder if that is one of the key issues that we're facing in terms of mobilising people.
And then there's one.
Thank you, Jeff, for a great book. I really enjoyed it, and I just dropped my computer telling you that. I wonder if you can talk to us about any trepidation you had about reactions that the left might have to being called smart. Because as I was reading, I was thinking, and has there been such a reaction? And secondly, I notice a careful use of the term authoritarianism in your discussion today. And I wonder if you could comment on the loose use of the word fascism and what is coming and when is it okay to call it that and when isn't. Thank you.
Okay, great. So what we might do is take a response to those either individually or collectively as you feel. And then we'll open it back up. I'm no way I'm going to be able to remember who is putting their hand up between things. So don't worry about indicating your hand. When I say we'll open it up again, I'll have another look and do it. We'll just listen and let it flow like that. Do you need a mic or you got one? Last one.
Well, gosh, there was a lot in that, and I'm sure I'm not going to be able to touch on all of it. On the question, though, of the contempt that increasingly people have for politicians, the sense that politicians are dirty and politics is a dirty business, I think that's a good thing. I think we should encourage that. I think actually that the alienation that people have from the political class and the political process is symptomatic of the rotten world that's been made for a young generation, and the sense that the people who are in charge have totally and utterly failed. So the argument that I'm trying to make is that the solutions that we need won't come through Parliament, and that we need the kinds of mobilisations akin to... So one of the things, in fact, I've been in a massive Twitter debate with various people from the Labor Party after an article I wrote the other day, and one of the things they were talking about is in terms of climate change. They were saying, well, look, you just need to get the right government in power, and Labor's policies are better than Liberals. So anyone who criticises the Labor Party is objectively on the side of climate change. I think this is kind of nonsense. That the sort of social change that we need is so massive that it's akin to, say, the changing attitudes that people had about women's role in society, say, from the 60s, 70s and 80s. That wasn't something that happened by a government being elected and making new law. I mean, there were some new laws that were passed, but that's not where the energy of that movement came from. It came from a massive social mobilisation all across the world. If we are going to save the planet, that is what we need. It's not going to come through Parliament, and the fact that most people have contempt for politicians is a good thing.
I was going to say, I am the only one in the room. I've had a look around. It's okay. I'm used to being in marginalised groups in various ways, while at the same time being in a ridiculous position of power. So it's good. I'm good with both of those things.
So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that, and this might be a little bit of a controversial one, but one of the things that I think has been one of the most significant victories that we've had in recent times was the result in the same-sex marriage plebiscite. And that whole process around the achievement of same-sex marriage just shows the massive gulf between the political class and ordinary people. It was customary on the left to say that actually Australians are incredibly homophobic, it's a tremendously bigoted society. Actually, the only reason we needed to have a campaign to win same-sex marriage is because the Liberal Party voted in 2009 to make same-sex marriage illegal. It wasn't illegal before then federally, and the Labor Party agreed with them and voted to support them. People like Penny Wong voted to support it.
And Tanya Plibersek, given we're in her electorate.
Yep. So then, because of that, because there was bipartisan support for homophobia, the campaign then had to engage in what I call direct politics, with people going out there and arguing and debating, and as a result, public sentiment changed extraordinarily quickly. And we had the result from the plebiscite where people had to go around, talking to their friends and their families and their neighbours. They convinced people. In a situation where people had to talk to their uncle or their friends or their family, they made an argument with them and they convinced them. And the result of that public vote definitively showed that the homophobes are in a minority in Australia, even in states like Tasmania, where in the 1990s, in some electorates, the majority of people voted to keep homosexuality illegal. Even in those electorates, the majority of people voted for same-sex marriage. An extraordinary social shift. And it happened because ordinary people campaigned. Just very...
Touch on the trepidation we want to know about.
Well, just quickly on the Daily Telegraph. Actually, I think that's a really good example of what we're talking about. I mean, I thought the Herald Sun was about, I've been in this city for a couple of weeks, and the Daily Telegraph is extraordinary newspaper. But I think its impact is minuscule. The majority of people who read it for the sports the same as they do the Herald Sun. If you look at any social survey that shows people's opinions about it, the levels of mistrust for the Murdoch media is through the roof. People flick it. People don't read fucking Andrew Bolt. They flick over it to see what's happening in fucking rugby or whatever. And so actually when the Murdoch press campaigns about something, dollars to donuts, they lose. If you think of all of their recent campaigns around things like same-sex marriage, they lose. One of the things that's happened in terms of mistrust in the political class, people don't believe these things anymore. So I think it's kind of overstated. In terms of the direction of, yes, obviously this was a book that I wrote with a degree of trepidation. As people might be aware, the debates around identity politics and political correctness are inordinately toxic. This is a bad thing, I think. These debates raise real issues that people on the left have to deal with. We ought to be able to discuss them in a comradely way, and I think it's important for people to try not to be intimidated by worrying about the reaction they will get if they say the wrong thing. This is also part of direct politics, isn't it? It's the idea that we ought to be able to exchange ideas, try to convince each other, have some degree of comradely solidarity. If someone has a wrong, it doesn't mean you accept backward ideas, doesn't mean you go along with racism or sexism, but you try to argue to overcome with them. You don't simply try to, cancel people or whatever. And to be honest, the reaction hasn't been nearly as bad. I mean, I've got some enemies, but and just finally on fascism, I've got a little book coming out very, very soon about the Christchurch massacre, which makes the argument that the perpetrator of the Christchurch massacre is a genuine fascist. This is part of a genuine sort of strategy of fascist terrorism. But I think it's something that needs to be kept in perspective. One of the things that that in these manifestos that these various terrorists are bringing out, one of the things that becomes really clear, the reason why they're engaging in terrorism is because they can't build mass movements. So they went through that process in 2017 of Unite the Right in America, where they tried to establish a sort of public fascist presence, and they were defeated. In Australia, the United Patriots Front tried to establish a Nazi political organisation, and they were defeated. That's why they're engaging in terrorism.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, so I might open it up. I'll go down here, and then up the back there, and then over here. So, yeah.
Hi. I also enjoyed your talk. And I like the idea of returning to participatory democracy, and my whole life's around that. However, my frustration is constantly with respect to climate change, that it's not just about changing people's minds, because it's about who owns the access to resources. And we are ignoring the huge and growing inequalities, and the fact that something like 8 human beings own half of the world's resources. And so no matter how many climate marches we have, we can't stop those people from continuing to exploit nature, which is what they're doing in bloody Brazil. The That's just horrific. And that's saying it's privatised, go ahead, make a profit, who cares what happens to the people? And we can't change their minds, or can we? What do we do about that?
Thank you.
I guess, a lot of the insights you brought in from the United States experience and the reaction to the Trump election. But in a lot of ways, I think we're living through it in the last 3 months in Australia, where a similar reaction has happened since the election of Morrison. This imbecile, evangelical, bigoted in every sense of the word person. How is it possible that he could have won the election? And, it's an understandable reaction, but the number of people who were like, Australian people are stupid, I'm moving to New Zealand, it was absolutely, sort of hegemonic on my Facebook feed for the first few weeks after that. And because I'm so involved in the refugee rights movement, what you're talking about is amplified tenfold in that campaign. Look at these stupid people who can vote for a continuation of such cruelty. Even though we know that it's not the issue that people often, put at the forefront of their vote, unless they're Greens voters often will vote on the basis of refugees, but a lot of people don't. So I guess whether you could tease out a bit further how this sort of smug politics plays out in the Australian context. But going back to the climate issue, I don't know, you probably agree, but I think, we saw in the wake of the election, people blaming the people of Queensland, particularly the fossil fuel workers, and I think it's incredibly significant that these high school students, through their own discussions and through their own course of the debate, have now added this demand for a just transition for those fossil fuel workers, and not seeing them as innately the enemy, but if you put forward a program, like that potentially they can be won over. So I think that does bounce off one of the central ideas of your book and the kind of, direct sort of democracy politics that we can take inspiration from and try and generalise through all of our campaigns.
This question that you've raised about direct democracy versus parliamentary, I guess you could say, representative democracy is incredibly important to all of us. One of the things that I think we can notice about the American elections is that the huge number of working class people who voted for Donald Trump in the Rust Belt. And I've actually heard people interviewed who said, I went to Bernie Sanders rallies and I would have voted for him if he had been the presidential candidate. And so the fact that people had Hillary Clinton as their choice was a very significant one. It was unfortunate that she was the woman candidate. And a similar kind of populist left-wing leader is, in a good sense, is Jeremy Corbyn. And we can see with both of them the way that they were severely attacked by the press. So we have the question of what is the voice? What is the voice of the vast democratic movement that we want to get going, the direct democracy? I have to disagree with you when you say that you think that the contempt for politicians is a good thing, because I don't think it is a good thing. I think it's utterly important for us to have representatives at the moment, because this is the only system we've got. This is the only system we've got to have a voice, and it's very important for us to have Jenny Leong out there representing us.
Thanks, Grace.
It's very important for us to have the voice that we have in Parliament. The thing is, how do we make sure that the mass, that the direct democracy happens through those representatives? That's the question. To make sure that those people, our representatives, remain faithful to the cause, and while we work out how real direct democracy can actually happen.
The question about the resources and the tiny number of people who own the world's wealth, I think, is a very good point. And every now and then, every few years, one of the aid organisations brings out that statistic where they say what proportion of the world, the richest 10 people
fit on the London bus.
Yeah, whatever. And it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But I think we have to have the confidence that we can defeat these people. I mean, the Adani campaign is an example of that. This is a huge multinational corporation. There's an awful lot of money and power behind making this mine happen in Queensland, but there is a real chance that the campaign against it will be successful. I think it's become such a flashpoint for so many people, and again, people hate these people. Do you know what I mean? Like, most young people look at the world being destroyed around them, and they don't look at these wealthy people in power and think, you are my heroes. They look at them and think, you people are criminals. So, I think it's that mobilisation that that we need. And that goes to the question about Morrison and the Australian elections. Yes, I totally agree. It does sort of exemplify the same issues that we saw in the United States. I mean, we are talking about all over the world a level of alienation from the political system and the political class. So this is not just me saying this. There's very robust statistics measuring this in all of the developed countries. That means that people mistrust political leaders. That meant that people mistrusted Bill Shorten. So the program that he brought to that election, even if it might have been nominally to the left of Labor's previous platforms, most people simply didn't believe that it was ever going to be kind of implemented. And I think it goes to what someone else was saying in terms of the figures like Corbyn, that in the context of the climate crisis, if you want people to believe that you have a real solution, you have to put forward a big program, and you have to go out there and argue that you are going to transform the entire economy along the lines of something like the Green New Deal with the just transitions that Mark was talking about. Because if you don't do that, people just don't believe it's real. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you tell people that you're just going to make a few little tweaks here and there and everything is going to be okay, we all know it's not going to be okay. And so in order to win trust, you have to actually say you have a solution to the level of problems. And in terms of the contempt for politicians, I mean, this is not the hill that I want to die on in particular. All I would say, however, that given that alienation from the political class, I think that the sort of orientation that we want to have on the left is to identify the people who are running the world at the moment as being our enemies. That these are people that we want to defeat. And so there are ways that you can do that in a parliamentary system, and there are ways that our representatives can do that. I mean, look, I know this is a Green event, so like my favourite memory of the Australian Greens is that time when Bob Brown was heckling George W. Bush in Parliament. And Kerry Nettle, yes, that's right. But it's that sort of attitude that you might be in Parliament, but you don't belong there, and you're not these kind of people. We are separate from them. I mean,
Can I offer a brief reflection on that? And I think it goes to something that I really wanted to raise, because the immediate response of the idea of going, okay, who and how are we having this conversation, and what privileges do you have when you get to have it, I think is important. And one of the things that I've really noticed since I've become an MP, and I think points to the idea of the problem with Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and Bernie, and Corbyn, and various other folk, is that we get into this cult of personality dynamic, which is then when we have this sort of champions, which I think then people see Barnaby Joyce speaking to thousands of people at a like crazy rally in Martin Place, and everyone's like, Barnaby is my man, and it becomes like this, it's like Jacinda Ardern, why can't we have one like her, and it becomes this kind of thing that is so detached from what is the actual issues that I think is hugely problematic, and I would argue is sort of like a weird neoliberal individualistic sense of democracy where we kind of just go, oh, okay, now we just want the individual to be the solution. But I do think that there is part of that then creates a problem around who is, we look around this room, it's not a particularly diverse room, and who are the people having the conversations, and if we go to an idea which it is about that sort of direct democracy, who is involved in that and how are they able to be involved in that, and who is excluded from that because of other realities about whether it's ability, race, language, education, whatever, and how do we make sure that that is inclusive in a way that doesn't just mean we see a different form of elitism over who gets to be the activists and who gets to be the people participating. That's a challenge, I think, right? There was an active decision by the Marriage Equality Campaign to not go and campaign in Western Sydney, and so everyone then blamed Western Sydney for being all anti-marriage equality, but actually they didn't have the conversations because everyone decided to not go there.
I mean, look, there's an awful lot to unpack. This is a complicated discussion. These are not issues that we're going to solve.
I wasn't expecting an answer.
but look, I just don't think we should be bashful about calling out the level of wealth and privilege that exists in this society and that is represented among the political class. I mean, the example I keep coming back to is Bronwyn Bishop and Christopher Pyne. People probably know this story about how both of them immediately after leaving their portfolios got jobs, massively well-paid jobs in industries which they were responsible for. Bishop had been, Julie Bishop, I said, did I say Bronwyn Bishop? Julie Bishop. Julie Bishop had been the foreign minister responsible for privatising foreign aid. She then got a job on the board of a company that had massive amounts of contracts delivering private aid. Pyne had been the defence minister who said that Australia needs to become a defence exporter. He's now an advisor for the defence industry. Not only did they do this, however, they both left with these extraordinary parliamentary salaries. I did a piece on this. Pyne is on $200,000 a year for the rest of his fucking life. So, people have a right to be angry about this. The kids who are never going to get a house in Australia have a right to be angry about it. I think the average parliamentarian has 2.4 properties, something like that. Yeah. So the gulf of wealth and privilege is extraordinary, and I think we should call it out.
Great.
Okay, Linda, and then I'm a councillor in local government, and what I find is that people have a really unrealistic view of the Greens and what they really are. They think I'm very conservative and very practical and not a real Green, and I constantly reinforce that I'm on the left. I think local government is really important to activism, to changing the masses' view of what the Greens are and what our policies are. But I don't think the Greens take local government seriously enough, and they don't use it to its best advantage, to the Greens' best advantage. And I'd like your opinion on how we could, or what you see the role of local government is, and how we could make better use of it.
I'm going to try and make this quick. I often despair as a young woman on the internet seeing the views of some young men who kind of have fairly extreme alt-right views. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on how as the left we should be communicating with these young men, or are we better just focusing our efforts on communicating with the kind of convincibles?
I'm basically making my living at the moment writing opinion pieces, and there's a real tendency to just have opinions about things that you know nothing about. I don't know anything about local government. I'm going to just leave it, rather than pretend to.
That's my point.
I think we're just putting the challenge that she'd like to see a column in The Guardian at some point in the future about the value of local government. It's a pitch.
Look, if you give me money, I'll write.
It's a pitch.
I'm not trying to be flippant about it. I just think that if I pun that, it would be a waste of everyone's time. On the question of the alt-right, I think this is actually a really important issue. I mean, one of the it's quite a sobering thing to realise that one of the most significant political disputes that has shaped so much of right-wing discourse and has led now to multiple deaths, not only in Christchurch but in other places around the world, is Gamergate, a dispute around computer games that happened a few years ago on the internet. And if people don't know what Gamergate is, it's too complicated to explain, but it was computer games basically that spawned the Milo Yiannopoulos and the Breitbart.coms and radicalised an awful lot of toxic young men. So I think I would say that we need to take these young men on the internet seriously. I mean, this is the milieu out of which the Christchurch massacre happened, and it's the milieu out of which the El Paso massacre happened as well. And if you've spent any time, which I don't recommend, but if you've spent any time on sites like 8chan, which is what I've been doing for this most recent book, I mean, the people there are celebrating each one of these massacres as they take place. They are toting up the number of people killed, and they're giving scores on it. So it's incredibly dehumanised and toxic. I think I would sort of separate our responses to it in terms of making a difference between the hardcore ideologues and the people who are just sort of falling into that milieu. I think you need to distinguish between the people that you think can be argued with and pulled back and the people who need to be defeated. And in a more general basis, I think that if you spend much time on those sites, what you see is this deep, deep despair about the future of society. One of the things that's increasingly becoming an issue for the far right and the fascist right, and it was manifested both in the El Paso massacre and the Christchurch massacre, is eco-fascism. So the expressions about the environment that have been used as an argument for fascism. These people are saying we need to defend the environment. The way to do it is to expel refugees and to defend our borders. Now, obviously, this is a ludicrous idea, but I think it's indicative of the way that the deep pessimism that everyone has about the future of the planet at the moment fosters these right-wing ideas. Like when you don't think that there is going to be a habitable environment in 50 years or 100 years' time, it's very easy to be, to fall down a kind of nihilistic rabbit hole. So in that sense, I think the more that we can build some sort of movement that's optimistic and that points towards a better future, the less attractive these horrific philosophers will be.
Thank you.
How we can transition to a different economy and what that might look like, specifically one that is not, drawing off all the resources of the planet and destroying everything and creating massive divide, inequality between the few and the many, but one that is more local, maybe, and sustainable and inclusive, so that people can, even in their local communities, can participate in a change for a healthier society and a sustainable future.
Sorry if I'm repeating anyone, I've been in the kitchen.
Totally, we love that.
But 2 points when you're talking about the eco-fascism thing. I think that's something our movement in general needs to be a little bit more aware of. Because as much as we can say that it's co-option and it's absurd, there is this very deep vein of Malthusian thinking that has existed in the environmental movement since it sort of intellectually came to started to coalesce in the 1970s. Things like questions around the population bomb being very popular back then, lifeboat ethics, and all of these ideas that are really, when you dig down to them, in the context of white supremacy, particularly in the context of a country like Australia, where we do have this sort of deep pathology about immigration, in spite of being a relatively high immigration country. Those things are things that I think our movement, the Greens, need to grapple with and sort of engage with the intellectual history of environmentalists who push back against those trends. But the other alliance that I find increasingly worrying is the one that some of our comrades in England and Wales seem to be flirting with, but definitely the French Green movement did, where a lot of people quite foolishly came in behind Macron and then proceeded to completely sort of help him greenwash pure neoliberal ideology. pure neoliberal ideology. The thing was that they covered for him while he was cutting taxes on the wealthy, and then applauded him when, for everybody who doesn't know, he increased diesel excise, which caused this massive protest wave. And you had figures like Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the great hero of 1968, out on who's quite close to Macron, coming out and supporting him, and he's a Greens politician. I think one of the things we have to think about when we're talking about democracy is really engaging with all of those temptations that the environmental movement has towards a more authoritarian politics that we don't always think about.
Thank you. And now this man over here is going to have absolute reason to hate politicians because I've been told I'm not allowed to get another question, so I'm going to have to ask you to sit down. You can hate on me all you want, but I'm more scared of Ann Pico than I am of you. So I'm going to throw that to Jeff to respond to those two questions. I'm going to ask Jeff to come down and have a chat to you afterwards because I feel bad at cutting you off. I'm really, really sorry. But we do have to stick to time. So Jeff, over to you to respond to those two, and I'm really, really sorry.
Well, just quickly, yes, in response to the points about Macron and eco-fascism, I mean, I do think the argument about smart politics is kind of relevant there. The Macron thing in particular is kind of exemplify that sort of notion that we need to, introduce environmental measures, and we're going to do it in spite of the population. We're not going to convince them, we're going to force them to accept these things. And, there's a sense in which eco-fascism grows out of that as well. I mean, the more the left is making arguments that the people are the problem, the easier it is to fascists to say, as the Christchurch perpetrator does, the people are the problem, that's why we should exterminate them. I mean, obviously I'm not saying that we're responsible for that, but you know what I mean. The two things, the more, you can flip it around, the more that we say to people the solution, the harder it is for these people to kind of get a hearing. And just finally, on the economy, I mean, obviously that is a huge issue, and we've got like 2 minutes, so we can't kind of resolve it. But I just would say that I think Australians are particularly well situated to think about alternatives to production for exchange, because, of course, in the history of this continent, the kind of economic system that we're now living in has only been around for a few hundred years. Prior to that, Indigenous people lived in a society where production was primarily for use, and in fact, one of the things that society did was it had a relationship with nature where human interaction actually improved nature rather than destroyed it. That humans tended the various, areas through, things like fire stick cultivation or whatever. Now, this is not a model that we can simply implement, but when you think about it, like the fact that it's possible to live in a society that improves nature through human interactions with a low level of technology should mean that, in theory, it's easier to do that when you have a high level of technology, because you actually understand more of a scientific basis about how, the way nature works and so on. So there's the notion that this idea is impossible is just crazy to me, because the majority of human history, that is how we have lived. And the system that we're living under now that is destroying the planet is very, very new. It's only been around for a few hundred years.
Thank you so much to everybody. And I wanted to reflect on how important it is to have people like Jeff being able to contribute to the discussion and the narrative, and really to say thank you. One of the things that I discovered as I was looking back over some of Jeff's writing was the fact that in 2011, when everyone was looking at the 10-year anniversary of the 9/11, that it was actually Jeff in the ABC drama at the time that had wrote a piece about the 11-year anniversary of S11. And this week I was talking to someone about the M1 protests that had happened in Sydney, and they looked blankly and had no idea what I was talking about. And I think that if there was ever something that was important, it's really important for us to remember and recognise the fact that we are working through what is a sense of history. That doesn't mean we have to always look back, but we should remember that these activist movements, these things have been happening and continue to happen. And rather than seeing them as new every time, it's important to have people that are part of the commentary of what is happening in our world that reminds us and continues to see the connection between what is happening now and what has happened before. So please, another big, massive round of applause for Jack.